I'm Emily Carter, 33 years old, the daughter my family trained themselves not to see. For years I thought staying quiet would keep the peace. Now I know silence only sharpens their knives. At every dinner, my mother's praise draped over my brother like silk. My father's approval landed only where legacy looked safe. And I sat in the shadows, tolerated but never embraced. The first time I dared to bring them something of my own, a business plan, my hope for independence, they laughed. Richard called it amateur. Margaret said I wasn't ready, and my father watched in silence. That silence hurt more than their scorn. It told me I was already erased. Ever been told you don't belong at your own table? Hit like if someone ever dismissed your worth before you could prove it. Comment if you've ever had to carry your value in silence. It all began with a phone call sharp, commanding the moment I realized Thanksgiving wouldn't be a dinner. It would be a trial. Her tone cut through the receiver like a gavel slamming down. It was never an invitation with her. Not really. It was a summons, sharp, unavoidable, weighted with the kind of authority she had wielded all my life. The words weren't warm or welcoming. They were cold and precise, like a surgeon's blade, and beneath them lay the same judgment that had followed me through years of strained gatherings. The moment I hung up, silence swelled inside my tiny New York apartment. It was the kind of silence that made every clock tick sound accusatory. I stood frozen by the window, staring out at the dull November sky, remembering other Thanksgivings. The polished silver at the mansion in Connecticut, the wine glasses clinking, the whispers that somehow always found their way to my ears. Each year had been a battlefield disguised as a dinner table, and this year the way her voice trembled with restrained disdain told me it would be worse. I tried to steady my breathing, but memories surfaced unbidden. Margaret correcting the way I held a fork, criticizing the clothes I wore, her glance sharp enough to peel back layers of skin. Even when I was a child, my plate had never seemed full enough, my posture never quite straight. My father, William, would sit in silence, his face half-shadowed behind the crystal glass he held, observing, but never intervening. He wasn't cruel like her, but he was absent in the moments that mattered. And absence, when you're desperate for an ally, feels like betrayal in its own right. The phone buzzed again. A message. Dinner at 7. Don't be late. Not a question, not a request. A command. I let the screen go dark, the glow fading against my hand. I walked through my apartment, taking in its modestness. The second-hand couch with uneven legs, the chipped table by the kitchen window, the quiet hum of the heater struggling against November's chill. Compared to the Carter mansion, its sprawling halls, marble floors, endless mirrors, it felt like another world. Yet this world was mine, chosen, paid for with sweat and sacrifices no one in that gilded house had ever made. And still, her words had found their mark. A familiar ache twisted in my chest. I could stay here, avoid the humiliation, let the evening pass without me. No one would miss me, not really. But then, there was another voice, the one I rarely listened to, the one whispering that running only proved her right. I opened my closet. The choices were limited, but I pulled out a dress I had saved for interviews and presentations. Conservative, but flattering. Respectable. I laid it across the bed, the fabric catching the faint glow of the lamp. Then I paused, eyes drifting toward the top shelf. A velvet box sat there, small enough to be overlooked, heavy enough to bend the air around it. My hand lingered on it for a moment, but I drew back. Not yet. I paced, debating aloud in the silence. What's the point? They'll laugh. They always do. My voice wavered, half daring, half defeated. The memory of Margaret's laugh echoed in my head low, cutting, always shared with someone else at my expense. For years, I had tried to avoid it, tried to be invisible. Tonight, something in me recoiled at that thought. I opened my suitcase on the bed. Its lining smelled faintly of travel, of times when I'd gone away just to escape. This wasn't an escape, though. It was a march towards something I had avoided for too long. I folded the dress carefully inside, then added shoes, a shawl, little things to shield me from the cold both outside and in that house. My hands trembled when they reached for the shelf again. This time, I pulled the velvet box down, the hinge creaking faintly as if even it knew the weight of what it contained. Gold and silver gleamed within, each piece catching the lamplight, each carrying a story: birthdays, forgotten celebrations, gifts once given as tokens of love or apologies. They weren't just ornaments. They were proof. Proof that I wasn't empty-handed. Proof that I wasn't broken. The reflection in the mirror startled me. My face was pale, but my eyes, My eyes burned in a way I hadn't seen before. Fear and resolve clashed there, like storm clouds split by lightning. If they want a show, I'll give them one. The words slipped out as a whisper, but once spoken, they lingered in the air, stronger than I expected. I nestled the box beneath layers of clothing in the suitcase, covering it as though it were contraband. My fingers pressed the latch down with finality. Emily closes her suitcase inside. Hidden beneath clothes lies a velvet box of jewelry. The Carter mansion gleamed under autumn lights, as if it had swallowed every trace of warmth and spit out gold. The long driveway unfurled like a ribbon of polished stone, lined with lamps that cast amber halos onto the gravel. My car felt painfully small, crawling toward the towering facade, every arch and column reminding me of the gulf between their world and mine. The house had always been a spectacle, but tonight it seemed less like a home and more like a stage set, ready to spotlight the smallest stumble, the faintest flaw. Inside, the scent of roasted turkey and expensive perfume mingled, but neither was comforting. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt her eyes on me, sharp, measuring, unyielding. Margaret stood near the entrance, her gown shimmering in champagne hues, lips pressed into that smile that wasn't a smile. One glance was enough to remind me. She saw everything, especially what she chose to label as shortcomings. I murmured a greeting. She didn't respond. Just a once-over, her eyes darting briefly to the small bag at my side before flicking away in disdain. The message was clear. I was tolerated, not welcomed. The dining room opened before me, glowing with chandeliers and polished mahogany, silver cutlery already set with military precision. The long table brimmed with relatives, their laughter too loud, too rehearsed. Every polished surface reflected back my presence as though mocking it. Blake was the first to pounce. He leaned back in his chair, wristwatch catching the light like a deliberate beacon. "Emily," he drawled, dragging my name as though it were a punchline. "Nice of you to join us. I wasn't sure if the city life would keep you too busy." His smirk lingered, sharp as a blade. Around him a few cousins chuckled, eager to echo his arrogance. I forced a smile. Some things are worth making time for. My voice didn't quiver, though my grip on the strap of my bag tightened. Richard, my uncle, chose that moment to chime in. His voice carried the weight of someone who loved the sound of his own authority. "Family is about belonging, Emily. An inheritance, in many ways, proves who truly belongs." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. The words hung like smoke, cloying and suffocating. My throat tightened, but then I caught a glimpse across the table. Lily, younger, softer, her presence almost fragile amid the noise, met my eyes. She didn't smile, not exactly, but the look was there, a flicker of sympathy, the faintest thread of connection. It steadied me more than I expected. I took a seat, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the fork. I could feel the weight of the velvet box in my bag by the chair, as though it had its own pulse, its own secret heartbeat. I kept my expression even, though part of me wanted to laugh at their ignorance. Conversation swirled around me, snippets of deals closed, vacations taken, acquisitions flaunted like trophies. Blake leaned in again, voice loud enough for others to hear. "Of course, some of us have worked hard enough to enjoy certain luxuries." His watch flashed again as he gestured, exaggerated, smug. I caught David Harris's gaze at the far end of the table. He wasn't family, just a guest, a friend of my uncle's, an appraiser of art and artifacts. He didn't join in the jeers or the boasts. Instead, his eyes lingered on the small leather case at my side, curiosity sparking before he turned away. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it told me he saw more than the others did. The turkey was carved, plates filled, wine poured. The clatter of cutlery filled the silence between pointed remarks. My mother finally broke it with a voice that cut sharper than any knife on the table. "Try not to embarrass us tonight, Emily." Her words weren't hushed, weren't cloaked in the privacy of a whisper. They rang out, deliberate, meant for the entire table to hear. A ripple of laughter followed from Blake, a smirk from Richard, silence from William. My father sipped his wine, eyes focused somewhere past me, as though distance was a refuge. I felt the sting, yes, but alongside it rose something else. Not shame, not fear, resolve. I gripped the fork in my hand until the metal pressed into my skin. My breath slowed, deliberate, steady. The box at my feet was more than jewelry. It was a shield, a weapon, a truth they weren't prepared for. If only they knew what I carried. The smell of roasted turkey pulled me back to another room. 5 years ago, where my own family carved me out. The laughter in the Carter mansion blurred, dissolved, and in its place the memory rose, sharp and merciless. I was 24 then, clutching a leather folder with trembling hands, heart thudding so loudly I could barely hear the rain beating on the office windows. The family council had gathered in Richard's downtown law office, a mahogany tomb where portraits of ancestors in gilded frames seemed to watch and judge every word. I'd spent months building the proposal, nights bent over spreadsheets, mornings running from job to scrape together seed money. I walked into that meeting believing that blood mattered, that family was more than shareholders with matching last names. My pitch was for a small tech startup, a platform I swore would bridge creative freelancers with clients, a business rooted in grit and fairness. Richard barely let me finish the opening slide before he chuckled. "Ambitious," he said, lips curling, "but amateur." His words fell like stones, shattering the fragile confidence I'd built. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks as though my future were a minor inconvenience interrupting his schedule. I looked at Margaret, praying for some kind of defense, some reminder that I was her daughter. But her expression was carved in marble, perfect and unyielding. "Emily, you're not ready," she said, cutting through my voice with precision. "This family invests in real ventures. You need experience, not fantasies." Each syllable sank deep. I felt my throat burn, but I pressed forward, voice catching as I tried to explain projected growth, market demand, anything. My father sat at the far end, hands folded, eyes drifting between us. For a moment, I thought I saw hesitation and urge to speak, but he didn't. He just sipped his water and let the silence cement my exile. The vote was swift, unanimous. No funds, no support, no acknowledgement that I had dared to dream. I gathered my folder, papers trembling in my grip, and walked out. The door closed behind me, with a click that sounded far too much like a lock. The air outside was sharp, the city lights blurred through my tears. I remember leaning against the building, clutching my notes to my chest like a shield that had failed. Rage surged hotter than grief. If they wouldn't back me, I would find another way. Their rejection didn't erase my vision, it only carved it deeper. It was later that week when Gerald called me into his cluttered studio. My mentor, a retired jeweler who had once believed in every sketch I drew, looked at me with those clear, unwavering eyes. He didn't ask what happened, he already knew. Instead, he opened a small velvet pouch and placed a ring in my palm. "It's not much," he said, voice rough with age, "but it's proof. Proof that someone believes." The ring was simple silver band, a modest sapphire, its edges worn smooth by years of craft. But in that moment, it was brighter than anything Richard or Margaret could flaunt. I slipped it on and felt something ignite. Not just defiance, but resolve. That ring became the first piece of my collection, not for its market value, but for the fire it carried. Every jewel since had been tied to a story, a triumph carved from the stones they hurled at me. The memory faded as the dining room swelled back around me, laughter slicing through the haze. My fork hovered above the plate, the aroma of turkey clawing at both present and past. I lowered my hand under the table, fingers brushing the cool metal circling my skin. The sapphire pressed against me, steady, grounding. Back in the mansion, surrounded by golden chandeliers and sneers disguised as smiles, I touched the ring under the table at the dinner. The knife sliced through the turkey and through me, with every word they tossed around the table. The blade glinted as Richard carved, each slice smooth, deliberate, like a verdict being handed down. The aroma of rosemary and butter filled the dining hall, but the taste never reached me. I sat rigid, fork balanced in my hand, eyes tracing the silverware reflections that distorted my face into something I barely recognized. Blake leaned back in his chair, his voice booming louder than necessary, each word carefully designed to reach me. "Closed another round this quarter," he said, patting his chest as if he carried Wall Street itself inside. "7 figures from a firm that knows real talent when they see it." He paused, eyes narrowing toward me, his grin widening. "Of course, some people still chase. What was it? Freelance dreams? Gig work? Sounds more like unemployment with extra steps." Laughter rippled around the table, shallow and brittle. Margaret dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, eyes fixed on me, her silence sharper than her son's words. Richard followed with a chuckle, carving another piece of turkey. "Not everyone deserves a seat at this table," he said, voice casual but blade precise, "let alone a share of what it represents." The room seemed to tilt. Candles flickered, shadows stretching long across the walls. I glanced at Lily, sitting 2 seats down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She avoided my gaze, but I caught the flicker of discomfort in her eyes, an unspoken apology she didn't dare voice. Then Margaret struck, her words as cold as the silver knife resting on the platter. "Emily," she said, drawing the entire table's attention, "you've always been the disappointment. Even tonight, you look broke." The laughter stopped. It wasn't needed. Her sentence hung heavier than the chandeliers above us, final and merciless. I felt the heat rush to my cheeks, my chest tightening as though the air itself was conspiring to crush me. For a heartbeat, I saw my younger self again, standing outside that law office with trembling hands, rejection ringing in my ears. But then something shifted. I inhaled slowly, steadying the storm that rose inside. My fork clinked gently against the plate, a sound so faint, yet it silenced the pounding in my ears. I straightened my shoulders, letting their sneers wash over me without anchoring in. A smile curved at the edge of my lips, not wide, not false, but deliberate. I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn, until I returned to my mother's. Inside my chest, the words pulsed, ready, waiting. "If they insist on a verdict, I'll deliver evidence." It was Lily's trembling voice that lit the match. I turned my head slightly, enough to catch her words, but not enough to draw Margaret's sharp gaze. Her lips barely moved, her breath warmer than the wine she hadn't touched. "I know how it feels," she whispered, eyes lowered, lashes trembling like they carried the weight of unspoken stories. For a moment, the noise of the dining hall dulled the clatter of forks, Blake's bragging about his latest fund, Richard's oily jokes about power and inheritance, all of it blurred into a distant hum. Lily's quiet confession cut deeper than their loud cruelty ever could. I studied her, this cousin who had always been painted as delicate, dependent, even forgettable. But I saw it then, the same raw ache, the same fracture in the armor. A kindred spirit. She had endured her own share of being diminished, sidelined, told she was less. And in her voice, so soft, I recognized a rebellion, however small, sparking to life. Margaret noticed, of course. She noticed everything. Her eyes snapped toward us, the way a hawk narrows in on prey. "Lily," she said coolly, lifting her glass with perfect posture, "stay in your place. No one is interested in irrelevant opinions." The table laughed again, but it was forced this time. Lily shrank back, cheeks pink, her hands folding under the table. Yet the damage had already been done. The words she offered me lingered like an ember pressed into my palm. I closed my hand around it, protecting it, feeding it with the air of my own resolve. I would no longer sit silent. I let my eyes sweep across the table, absorbing their smirks, their mockery, their conviction that I would forever occupy the shadowed corners of this family. Then I lifted my glass, the stem steady between my fingers. My voice, when it came, was calm, unhurried, but it cut through their chatter like a bell tolling in a silent square. "Shall we toast," I said, the words deliberate, "to the ones who keep their worth hidden?" The room stilled. Knives paused mid-air. For a fleeting second, even Margaret froze, eyes narrowing. Blake's face, however, twisted first into disbelief and then into derision. He leaned forward, laughter bursting from him in sharp, cruel notes. "Worth? You?" His voice filled the room, mocking, certain. He sneered, savoring the moment, his gaze daring me to defy him further. "Don't make me laugh." While they drowned in laughter, I slipped away to breathe and to plot. The dining hall pulsed behind me with muffled clinks of silverware and bursts of laughter sharp as glass. Their voices carried through the walls Margaret's commanding tone, Blake's smug boasting, Richard's syrupy mockery, all blending into a cruel chorus that had scored my entire life. I pressed a hand against the cool wood paneling of the hallway, drawing in a breath that wasn't laced with their derision. Here, away from their eyes, my chest loosened, though the fire beneath my ribs burned hotter. I wasn't running. I was preparing. The velvet box weighed in my suitcase upstairs like a hidden verdict, and I could almost feel its presence even now. They thought I was defenseless, broke, diminished. They had no idea that beneath my quiet exterior lived a reservoir of proof tokens of every battle I had fought alone, symbols of survival they had refused to witness. A shuffle of steps broke my concentration. When I turned, David Harris emerged from the shadows of the corridor, his figure outlined by the faint amber glow of sconces. His suit was neat, understated compared to Blake's flashy cufflinks, but his eyes caught details others missed. He had been silent at the table, almost deliberately forgettable, but here his presence carried weight. "I noticed," he said softly, nodding toward the small leather satchel at my side. My fingers curled protectively around the strap. "Noticed what?" His gaze was sharp, but not unkind. "That you brought more than clothes. You keep adjusting the bag like it holds something precious. I've seen it before." He paused, lowering his voice. "Jewelry, isn't it?" For an instant my breath hitched. The mansion's walls seemed to lean closer, waiting for my reply. He didn't smirk like Blake, or sneer like Richard. His expression held curiosity, recognition professional, but layered with something else. Respect. "You're observant," I murmured. "Wary." "I'm an appraiser," he confessed, almost apologetic, as if revealing a secret he wasn't sure he should share. "I've handled collections most people would mistake for trinkets. But I saw the way you touched that case earlier. That wasn't vanity, it was confidence. Real value doesn't need to announce itself." The word struck deeper than he could know. Confidence. The very thing they had tried to strip from me years ago in that law office when my voice had been drowned by their dismissals. For the first time tonight I felt seen. Footsteps creaked at the far end of the hall. Lily stood hesitantly in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dining room's light. Her eyes flicked between me and David, wide with questions but filled with a quiet kind of encouragement. She didn't speak, but her presence said enough. She was with me, however silently. David leaned closer, his breath almost brushing my ear, his tone deliberate and low. "If you ever need me to speak for you tonight, I will." The offer hung in the air, solid as stone. My heart raced not with fear, but with the dangerous thrill of possibility. For the first time, the walls of the mansion didn't feel like a prison. They felt like a stage. I might just take him up on that. Back at the table, their smiles had sharpened into blades. I slipped back into my seat as the waitstaff carried in the desserts, delicate slices of pumpkin pie, dollops of whipped cream, cinnamon dusted like fine snow. The sweetness on the plates mocked the bitterness in the air. No one had noticed my absence, or if they had, they relished ignoring me. Their voices rose and overlapped, laughter that carried the edge of knives. Blake, ever the self-proclaimed prodigy, leaned back in his chair, cufflinks flashing like signals of conquest. "Startups," he scoffed, stabbing his fork into the pie with unnecessary force. "They're bubbles waiting to pop. Real money doesn't float on dreams, it sits in bricks and land. That's why I doubled down on real estate this year. Properties in Manhattan, a summer home in Miami. You know, actual assets." His smirk slashed across the table like a whip. A ripple of agreement spread among the uncles and aunts. Richard, his voice oily, picked up where Blake left off. "Speaking of assets," he said, swirling his wine with theatrical nonchalance, "rumor has it Father's new will is undergoing revisions. And let's just say it doesn't look kindly on dreamers without solid footing." He lifted his glass, the crimson liquid catching the chandelier light like blood. "To those who build empires, not castles in the air." The laughter that followed cut deeper than Richard's words. I felt every eye glance toward me, some lingering, others darting away too quickly, as if ashamed to be caught enjoying the spectacle. Margaret, my mother, seized the moment. Her pearls clinked softly against her glass as she leaned forward, gaze fixed squarely on me. "Emily," she said, her tone sweetened with venom, "do you remember when you insisted you didn't need our help? You called it independence." She chuckled, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "I call it fool's pride. Some people don't know the difference between freedom and foolishness." The words dropped onto the table like lead, silencing even the polite clatter of forks. My skin prickled, but I didn't flinch. If anything, her cruelty was expected, as rehearsed as a play she had been staging for years. Across the table, William's hands tightened around his utensils, knuckles whitening. His gaze flicked between Margaret and me, his lips pressed thin as if they held back something: anger, regret, maybe both. He said nothing, as always. His silence was a habit, but tonight it carried weight. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the subtle tremor of his jaw. Blake leaned in again, emboldened by my mother's disdain. "She still doesn't get it, does she? It's not about ideas or passion projects. It's about leverage, about being taken seriously. You can't buy a seat at this table with wishful thinking." He laughed, a harsh bark that grated more than it amused. Richard added fuel, his voice syrupy, almost indulgent. Family legacies aren't built on rebellion, dear. They're maintained by loyalty, by staying in line. Perhaps one day you'll see that, though by then it may be too late. The dessert in front of me might as well have been ash. Each word was meant to strip me bare, to remind me that in their eyes I was still the exile, the outcast who had dared to stand apart. And then Margaret delivered the cruelest strike, her voice rising above the din. Some of us build legacies, she declared, her gaze boring into mine. Others beg at the table. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Even the staff paused, glancing nervously toward the family drama, unraveling like a slow-motion car wreck. The chandelier hummed faintly above us, crystals trembling from the weight of the unspoken. I looked down at my hands, steady against the linen tablecloth, then lifted my eyes to meet theirs. The fire in my chest no longer burned wild, it sharpened, focused, becoming something colder, more dangerous. Enough. The trial ends tonight. I rose, glass in hand, and silence spread like spilled wine. The scrape of my chair against the polished floor drew every eye. Candles quivered in their holders, throwing long shadows across the walls, as if even the flames knew to hold their breath. Richard's monologue about the family's enduring prosperity was cut short mid-sentence, his lips still parted, his glass frozen halfway to his mouth. I lifted mine, steady, not trembling. My reflection wavered in the dark liquid, and for a heartbeat, I saw both past and present layered there. The girl who had once been dismissed in a law office years ago, and the woman standing now, no longer willing to be carved apart like the turkey on the platter. "Forgive the interruption," I began, voice even, cutting through the tension like a quiet blade, "but I believe it's time for a different kind of toast." A murmur rippled down the table. Blake rolled his eyes and let out a theatrical groan. Margaret leaned back with the smile of someone watching a child attempt to lecture adults, her hand draped over the stem of her glass with practiced elegance. William's gaze flickered up at me, unreadable, though his fist still rested tautly against the linen, a sign of the restraint he was barely holding on to. "I've listened tonight," I continued, moving my eyes across them all, Richard, Blake, Margaret, even the cousins who dared not breathe too loudly. "I've heard the same refrains I've heard all my life. That worth is measured in titles, in square footage, in the thickness of a wallet, or the weight of an inheritance. But I've learned something they don't teach at these tables: resilience." The word hung there, foreign to their rehearsed banter. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between plates and glasses as though searching for safety in porcelain and crystal. Blake let out a laugh, sharp and humorless. "Resilience doesn't buy property, Emily. You can't toast with that." I smiled faintly, unbothered. "Number, but betrayal teaches it, and survival proves it. Hidden worth," I let the word sharpen with intention, "is still worth. Even if it doesn't shout from rooftops." David Harris, still at the far end of the table, set his glass down with the faintest clink. His eyes caught mine for a fraction of a second, subtle, but enough. He knew, and he was waiting. Lily's gaze lingered on me, wide, hopeful. Her small hands curled into fists on her lap, as though she were willing me forward with silent prayers. I raised my glass higher, voice steady, carrying through the vaulted room. Not all treasures are flaunted, some are forged in fire. The hush that followed pressed down like a velvet curtain. Even the clinking of cutlery had stilled. My words, plain but deliberate, unsettled the rhythm of their cruelty. For once, I had taken the script from their hands and rewritten the scene. Richard muttered something under his breath, forcing a laugh to mask unease. Blake scoffed loudly, shaking his head, dramatic, as always. "Hidden treasures? Spare us the poetry. If you had anything real to show, you would have shown it years ago." And then Margaret leaned forward, pearls catching the flicker of candlelight, her smirk slicing deeper than any knife. "Treasures?" she said, her voice syrupy sweet, sharpened with mockery. "Let's see what your empty hands hold." They wanted proof. They wanted blood. I would give them both. The words formed in my mind as I sat, glass still in hand, every eye fastened on me like a jury waiting for the condemned to speak. Margaret's smirk had poisoned the air, but it was Blake who lunged first, eager to draw blood from the wound she opened. "Go on, then," he sneered, leaning forward, his cufflinks flashing under the chandelier. "Show us what you've got. Show us what you're worth." His voice dripped with condescension, as though daring me to crumble the way I had before. Richard's chuckle followed, low and venomous. "She's bluffing. Just like 5 years ago when she came begging with her little business pitch. Empty promises then, empty hands now. His glass tipped lazily in my direction, red wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim, as though even gravity mocked me. The others murmured their agreement, the weight of their judgment pressing down like a stone on my chest. For a moment, silence pooled thick between us, broken only by the faint clink of silverware abandoned in anticipation. I let it linger, let them lean into their certainty. Then, slowly, I reached beneath the table, fingers brushing fabric until they closed around velvet. My heartbeat thrummed steady now, not erratic with fear, but with something colder, sharper. The box touched the linen with a muted thud, small yet commanding. Conversations died completely. The room seemed to shrink around it, as though every chandelier crystal bent light toward the single object now sitting between us. Margaret laughed. That? Her voice climbed higher, nearly breaking into a cackle. A trinket box? My God, Emily, you've outdone yourself. If you're going to embarrass me, at least do it with flair. Blake leaned in, hungry, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Open it, he pressed, impatient. Unless you're hiding dust. I drew in a measured breath, my fingers sliding across the lid. The velvet was warm now, alive from where my hands had held it through every slight, every insult tonight. With a soft motion, I lifted it. The first glint of gemstones caught the candlelight, a spark that leapt across the table like lightning. Gasps escaped lips that moments ago were pursed with disdain. Emeralds, rubies, diamonds carefully set, timeless pieces, each one bearing the weight of my survival, my defiance. Whispers broke out. Guests leaned forward, some craning necks, others clutching at their pearls as if their own finery paled in comparison. Richard's smirk faltered, just slightly. Blake's eyes darted between the jewels and my face, trying to decide if this was another elaborate bluff, some theatrical imitation. And then Margaret's laughter cut through again, shrill and dismissive. Costume jewelry, she scoffed, waving her hand as though brushing away dust. How fitting for a pretender. Her words hit the air with the sharpness of glass shattering, but I did not flinch. Instead, I let my lips curl into the faintest smile, my voice steady, controlled, laced with steel. Funny, I said, letting the pause stretch until silence pressed close again, because this piece alone could buy your son's entire portfolio. Gasps turned to whispers until David's voice cut clean. May I? Every head swiveled toward him. For most of the evening, he had been little more than a shadow at the far end of the table, an invited family friend, an art world professional tucked discreetly into the background. But his voice now carried a gravity that hushed even the most eager tongues. Margaret's brows arched, annoyance sparking in her eyes. And who exactly do you think you are to interrupt? She asked, her tone brittle, meant to wound. David stepped forward, unshaken, his suit catching the glow of the chandelier. His presence alone seemed to shift the air in the room. David Harris, he said evenly, accredited appraiser, member of the American Society of Jewelry Historians. You invited me here tonight, though perhaps not for this purpose. But since there are questions, allow me to answer them. For the first time all evening, silence had weight. Even Blake sat back, lips pressed thin, his bravado dimming under the certainty in David's voice. He extended a steady hand toward me. May I? He asked again, softer now, directed only to me. I nodded once and slid the box closer. He picked up the first piece, a ring set with a deep green emerald, its facets catching the candlelight in a flash that silenced Margaret's derision. David lifted it as though it were a relic. This stone, he said, voice carrying like a verdict, is a Colombian emerald, early 20th century, cabochon cut. Its provenance is impeccable. At auction, I would estimate between $80,000 and $100,000 conservatively. Gasps rippled down the table. Forks clattered as a few guests forgot themselves. I let the weight of his words settle before adding, it was given to me by Gerald Ross, the mentor who believed in me when no one else would. He told me it was proof that someone saw my worth. Margaret's smirk twitched but did not vanish. She waved a dismissive hand, though her fingers tightened around her glass. One ring does not a fortune make, she said, voice brittle. David placed the emerald carefully back into the box and lifted the next. A sapphire pendant, rich and dark, framed in platinum. He studied it briefly before turning it toward the room. Art Deco circa 1925, he announced. Cartier, rare. Auction houses in Geneva or New York would compete fiercely for this. $500,000 would be a modest estimate. Even Richard's practiced mask faltered, his jaw stiffening as murmurs swelled again. "This pendant," I said, my voice steady. "I purchased after closing my first independent contract. Not family money, mine." The room stilled further. Each piece David raised carried not only weight in carats but in story, in survival etched into gold and stone. One by one, a diamond brooch marking my first office lease, a ruby bracelet I bought to honor a lawsuit I won, a pair of earrings gifted by a woman entrepreneur I'd once helped. Each story chipped away at the years of silence they had used as a weapon against me. Finally, David set the last piece, a platinum ring, with pave diamonds, back into the box. He straightened, gaze sweeping the table with quiet authority. "This is not costume jewelry," he declared, each word deliberate, final. "This is legacy." The word landed like a gavel strike. Murmurs surged again, but none dared laugh. Margaret's smirk was gone entirely now, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Blake stared at the collection as though it were a snake about to strike. Richard's eyes narrowed, calculating, but he said nothing. And then, after an eternity of silence, William's voice broke through, low and resonant, startling in its sudden firmness. "Enough lies," he said, his eyes on Margaret now, not me. "It's time the family sees the truth." When my father's voice rang out, the entire mansion froze. The echo of his baritone clashed with the crystal still chiming from David's appraisal. It was not the hesitant murmur of a man who often receded into the background. It was sharp, final, like the crack of a gavel that forced silence across the dining hall. Forks hung in midair. Glasses hovered untouched. Even Margaret's ever-ready sneer faltered for a heartbeat. I had never seen William like this. My father, always the watcher, the man who preferred to study the surface of his wine rather than the storm brewing across the table, now fixed his gaze on my mother with something fierce, almost unfamiliar. The chandelier light caught the tension in his clenched jaw. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying through the vaulted room. "No more of this charade." Margaret recovered quickly, smoothing her expression into one of practiced dismissal. She leaned back in her chair, her rings tapping the stem of her glass. "Oh, William," she drawled, "must you ruin the evening with your sentimentality? She's your daughter. Of course you pity her. But pity is not proof." The room shifted like a jury caught between arguments. Blake snorted, seizing the moment. "Dad, don't let emotions blind you. Emily's playing a role, like she always has. She's bluffing, dangling a few stones she can't possibly understand." I drew a breath, steady, and placed my hand over the open velvet box. "Bluffing? Let me remind you." My voice carried, not loud but clear, each syllable deliberate. I lifted the emerald ring David had named and held it high, so every eye caught the glimmer. "This ring was not inherited. It was entrusted to me after you all dismissed me 5 years ago. While you sat here ridiculing, someone believed in me. And when I fought for my own contracts, when I built what you said I never could, each piece here came from that fight." Gasps whispered like wind through the room. Aunts, uncles, distant cousins' faces blurred together, but I saw their doubt quiver. Richard's lips curved into a sneer, his voice oily with disdain. "Pretty stories, but stories don't change a will. The documents are signed, sealed, and recognized by law. You think parading trinkets and bedtime tales will undo that?" William's hand slammed against the table, rattling the silverware, startling the younger cousins who jumped in their seats. The sound cracked through the tension like thunder. His eyes bored into Richard. "No more lies," he thundered. "This family has hidden behind documents, signatures, and whispers for too long. Tonight they learn who has built real worth not on false promises, not on manipulation, but on grit." The room held its breath. Margaret's painted lips curled back into a snarl, the mask slipping at last. She leaned forward, every word a blade. "You think this makes you one of us? Think again." Their empire of scorn cracked, one gemstone at a time. The silence after my father's outburst was so complete that I could hear the wax dripping from the tall white candles, the faint hiss as it met the silver holders. All eyes were fixed on the velvet box that still lay open before me, its contents gleaming like quiet witnesses. David cleared his throat softly, stepping forward as though he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. "This collection," he said, his voice measured, calm, yet laced with authority, "is extraordinary. Piece by piece, it speaks of not only value, but provenance. These are not decorative baubles bought on whim. They are milestones, artifacts of triumph. If I were to give you a combined estimate, The number would eclipse nearly every one of Blake's so-called real estate ventures. The collective gasp rippled around the table like a wave breaking against stone. Blake flushed, his jaw tightening, his bravado cracked under the weight of David's pronouncement. I lifted a sapphire pendant delicately, the one gifted after I closed my first contract overseas. This was earned when no one believed I could manage a single deal without this family's shadow. Yet I did. Alone. Then I slid my fingers over a pair of diamond earrings, small, but radiant. These marked the moment a mentor honored my resilience after you all mocked me as reckless. Every piece here is proof. Proof that while you tried to carve me out, I carved my own place, Richard sputtered, his face blotched with the color of indignation. Nonsense! Trinkets dressed up as legacy. She's manipulating sentiment, that's all. You cannot dress up failure with sparkle. I fixed him with a steady gaze, my voice sharp enough to slice through his protest. Failure? You've hidden your failures behind this mansion's walls for years. Behind contracts no one reads. Behind a will that benefits only the obedient. But my worth isn't ink on paper, it's here, and no decree of yours can erase it. Margaret's mask finally cracked. Her tone turned feral, bitter venom spilling unrestrained. You were never supposed to rise. You were supposed to stay small, grateful for scraps, invisible. That was the role you were meant to play. Her words, meant to shame, landed instead as a confession. The room stiffened, shocked at the naked hostility of a mother toward her own child. Even Lily, timid Lily, straightened in her seat, her eyes flashing with something like recognition. I rose slowly, letting the weight of silence build, then spoke with the clarity of a blade honed over years of exile. You called me broke. Tonight, you'll remember me as the one thing you never were: independent. The statement cut through the air, leaving no room for rebuttal. Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Blake swallowed his protest, and then my father's voice rang again, deliberate, unshakable. Enough. Tomorrow I will rewrite my will. Emily will take her rightful place in this family's legacy. Gasps erupted, chairs scraped, whispers tumbled like thunder rolling down marble halls. For the first time, Margaret looked cornered, her empire of scorn collapsing under the weight of truth laid bare. Their faces fell like statues struck by hammers. For a moment, no one moved. The dining hall, once roaring with condescension and forced laughter, now trembled with the soundless shock of truth finally unveiled. My father's pronouncement still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, and it was consuming the carefully built image that Richard, Blake, and especially Margaret had spent years maintaining. Richard was the first to break. He lurched forward in his chair, his voice rising, brittle and desperate. This is absurd, William. You can't simply undo decades of structure because of her parade of trinkets. He jabbed a finger in my direction, his face purple with indignation. This isn't legacy. This is manipulation. My father didn't flinch. His hand rested firmly on the table, his gaze steady. No, Richard. What's manipulation is the years of silencing her, undermining her, cutting her down to nothing. I let it happen. That's my shame. But it ends tonight. The gasps returned, low and dangerous, spreading among the guests. I could feel their eyes shifting, recalibrating, reevaluating who truly held ground in this fractured empire. For once, it wasn't Richard's voice filling the void. Blake pushed back his chair with a screech, his face contorted into something between rage and fear. This family is finished if you do this. You'll ruin us all. And you, his eyes shot at me, blazing, you'll drown in the debts you can't even begin to imagine. But the bravado slipped too quickly. His words rang hollow, and his own guilt bled through in the tremor of his voice. Guests exchanged looks. Whispers of debts and gambling began to swirl around the table. Blake realized too late that his outburst had betrayed him. He stormed out of the dining hall, muttering curses under his breath, his footsteps echoing down the marble corridor until they faded into silence. For the first time, Blake Carter, the heir apparent, had looked small. The real blow came to Margaret. She sat rigid, her hands white-knuckled against the polished table. Her power had always lived in her voice, in her perfectly sculpted scorn. But now, as the guests glanced toward her not with admiration but with suspicion, her veneer cracked. A woman at the far end of the table whispered, "How could a mother speak so of her own child?" Another man leaned toward his wife, muttering, "We never knew Emily had achieved so much. Why was it hidden?" Margaret heard them. She heard it all. Her lips trembled before her pride forced them back into a thin, disdainful line. but the murmurs spread like infection, pulling her authority apart thread by thread. Lily, silent until now, leaned slightly toward me. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as if watching a story she'd only ever dreamed might be told. I saw awe there, and hope. The timid cousin who once kept her head bowed had just seen a different way to live. Richard tried one last time, his voice low, begging now instead of commanding. William, think carefully. If you do this, everything we've built unravels. The partnerships, the investments. But my father cut him off with a single word. Enough. The sound was final. Margaret's restraint shattered. Her chair scraped violently against the floor as she stood, her face contorted in fury. You'll regret this, Emily, she spat, her voice sharp as glass, slicing across the silence. You think this makes you victorious? You've invited ruin. You'll regret it until your last breath. I rose too, slow, deliberate, letting her venom wash over me without striking. My voice, when it came, was calm, steady, and far more dangerous than her rage. I've regretted nothing more than staying silent. That ends tonight. The words hung heavy, sealing the fracture wide open. The Carter family's empire had collapsed within its own walls, and no amount of fury could rebuild it the way it once was. Silence settled, but it was no longer heavy, it was cleansing. The echoes of shouting and shattered pride still lingered in the air. But here, in the library, the storm had finally passed. The long rows of books, the velvet armchairs, the dim amber glow of a single lamp, it felt like another world compared to the battlefield of the dining hall. I stood near the window, the reflection of my own face faintly visible in the glass, and for the first time all evening, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. My father entered quietly, his footsteps softer than I had ever known them to be. He looked older in the low light, his eyes weighed down not only by years, but by the burden of choices he had made, or avoided making, for far too long. He paused near the doorway as if unsure he had the right to come closer. Emily, he said, voice gravelly, I owe you an apology. I turned, startled not by the words but by the sincerity in his tone. My father had been many things in my life: aloof, distracted, distant, but never contrite. An apology? I asked, my voice gentler than I expected. He nodded slowly. For my silence, for watching you suffer, belittled, dismissed, for not stepping in when I should have. I thought, keeping peace meant keeping quiet. But all it did was deepen the wounds. He shook his head, his shoulders sagging. You carried those scars alone, and tonight I saw the strength they forged in you, a strength I should have honored from the beginning. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The girl I was 5 years ago, humiliated, shoved out of the family council without a voice, rose up inside me, aching to be acknowledged. I swallowed hard. Scars remain, I admitted softly. But scars are proof of survival. Tonight, for the first time, I don't feel like the family's shadow. I feel seen. He reached out, hesitant, before resting his hand on my shoulder. I see you, Emily. And I'm proud. The words pierced me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a cure, but it was something like light finding its way through broken glass. The library door creaked open again, and Lily stepped in. She looked almost timid, as if afraid to intrude, but her eyes glistened with something more than fear, admiration perhaps, or longing. I wanted to thank you, she whispered. I frowned. For what? For standing up tonight, she said, wringing her hands together. For showing me it's possible. All these years I've buried my own dreams, my sketches, my canvases. I let them convince me art was worthless, that I was worthless if I chose it. But watching you, her voice trembled, then steadied. Watching you refuse to bend, I felt something awaken again. I reached for her hand and held it. They told me the same. That independence was foolish, that dreams had no value. But we both know value isn't measured by their approval. Don't let them silence you the way they tried to silence me. Her lips trembled, but she nodded, a tear slipping free. I want to try again. I want to paint. Before I could reply, David entered quietly. He had remained on the sidelines since the explosion in the dining hall, but here, away from the family's eyes, his presence felt steady, reassuring. He smiled faintly at me, his voice low but firm. You handled yourself with remarkable courage tonight, Emily. Many would have broken under their cruelty. You didn't just endure, you turned the trial into testimony. I met his gaze, a warmth, blooming where the evening had left ashes. It wasn't just for me, I said. It was for every time they told me I was nothing. David inclined his head. And tonight you proved them wrong. The moment held, thick with meaning. I turned back to my father, who lingered still, as though afraid the reconciliation might vanish if he left too soon. Justice delayed is bitter, but justice delivered is sweet. The words tasted final, as though they closed one chapter of my life and opened another. My father lowered his head, acknowledging not only the truth of the statement but the justice that had finally begun to settle in this house. Then Lily's voice, soft but urgent, broke the silence. "Emily, will you stand by me if I fight too?" Her question hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, a spark of defiance echoing my own. And in that moment, I knew this battle was no longer just mine. It was the beginning of something larger. By morning, the Carter name no longer owned me, I owned myself. The first light of dawn stretched across the sprawling lawns of the estate, bathing the mansion in pale gold. The air was sharp and clean, a crisp November bite that cleared the haze of the night before. My suitcase was packed, my velvet box secured inside. For years I had left this place with shame trailing behind me, shoulders hunched, words unspoken. This time, I walked toward the doors with my head high, the weight in my hands no longer a burden, but a banner. William stood waiting in the grand foyer. His presence was not the hollow silhouette it once had been, but a man who had finally chosen to act. He offered no speeches, only a gesture. He took my suitcase and carried it for me, as though acknowledging, in the sight of the family and the guests who still lingered in awkward whispers, that his daughter deserved respect long overdue. Each step we took toward the doors was witnessed, a silent verdict more powerful than any declaration. Margaret appeared at the top of the staircase, her figure rigid, lips pressed so tightly they looked bloodless. She said nothing. For once, her arsenal of sneers and barbs was empty. She watched me pass, eyes narrowed, hands clenching the banister. But silence was the only weapon left to her. And in that silence, I tasted victory. Lily was already waiting outside, her coat drawn tight against the chill. When she saw me, her face broke into a smile trembling with both relief and resolve. She threw her arms around me, clinging as if afraid the courage she had borrowed from me might fade with distance. "I'll do it," she whispered against my shoulder. "I'll fight for myself, for my art. I won't let them bury me." I hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth of her defiance stir against my own. "Good," I told her softly, "because surviving their judgment isn't enough. You deserve to live, not just endure." She nodded, her eyes shining with a new kind of fire. The chauffeur opened the door to the waiting car, but before I stepped inside, I turned to take one last look at the mansion. Its towering walls and marble columns loomed as they always had, symbols of power and legacy. But now I saw cracks in the stone, fissures where their empire of control had begun to crumble. It no longer dwarfed me. It no longer defined me. As the engine rumbled and the estate began to fade into the horizon, my thoughts returned to every jeer, every dismissal, every cruel word that had carved scars into me. I carried them still, but tonight they had transformed. They had become the setting for my trial, and I had delivered the evidence. My family called me a failure, a beggar, a pretender. Yet when the truth shone through the cut of gemstones, when my father finally broke his silence, when I stood without faltering, I realized something they never could take from me. They called me broke. Tonight, I became priceless. The sun rose higher, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose. Beside me, the velvet box rested like a quiet promise, each piece inside not just a treasure but a testimony. Lily's words echoed in my heart, William's silent respect lingered in my mind, and Margaret's powerless glare reminded me of the chains I had shattered. The car carried me away, but I wasn't running anymore. I was leaving on my own terms, stepping into a life that no longer begged for permission. And as the road opened before me, long and unwritten, I knew the truth of it, steady and undeniable. And this is only the beginning. The long night of betrayal ended with truth laid bare and power shifting to where it belonged. What once felt like chains of silence had become weapons of proof, and those who mocked were finally unmasked. Justice does not arrive quickly, but when it comes, it strikes like thunder, reminding us that courage in the face of cruelty can rewrite any verdict. No empire of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If you found strength in this journey, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you felt the same, or 2 if you still long for more.